At 1,400 hours on June 28, 1944, General Leutnant Dietrich Fansen stood at the railway junction in Boris, 30 kilometers northeast of Minsk, watching the 5th Panzer Division unload tanks from rail cars while Soviet artillery fire fell on the roads behind them. The division had arrived the previous day, June 27, transferred from Army Group North Ukraine with 125 tanks, 70 Panther medium tanks, 55 Panzer Mark V tanks, and 29 Tiger heavy tanks from the 505 Heavy Tank Battalion. They were among the last fully equipped German armored units on the Eastern Front. Von Ohlen had been ordered to form a Kampfgruppe from these forces and whatever remnants he could gather from the shattered units streaming west. His mission was to hold the approaches to Minsk long enough for the Fourth Army to escape encirclement. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army was approaching from the northeast with over 200 tanks. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps was coming from the east. The 65th Army was moving up from the south. Von Agawin's Kampfgruppe would be outnumbered at least 10-1. The problem was not the equipment. The 5th Panzer Division was at full strength, unusual for German units in mid-1944. The Panthers had the best tank gun on the Eastern Front. The Tigers could destroy any Soviet tank at ranges where they themselves were nearly invulnerable. The crews were experienced, many having fought at Kursk the previous summer. But numbers mattered. Soviet industry was producing more tanks in a month than Germany produced in 6 months. The Red Army could afford losses that would German operations. German doctrine emphasized mobile defense, preserving forces for counterattacks. But Adolf Hitler had declared Minsk a Festerplatz, a fortified position to be held at all costs. The Fourth Army, nearly 150,000 men, had been ordered to stand fast east of the city despite being bypassed on both flanks. Fans understood the mathematics. His camp group could delay the Soviets, perhaps by the Fourth Army a few more days to withdraw, but they could not stop the offensive. Von Alsen had commanded the 4th Panzer Division earlier in the war, fighting at Kursk and in the defensive battles around Gomel. He had been wounded twice, received the Knight's Cross with oak leaves and swords, and earned a reputation as one of the most capable panzer commanders on the Eastern Front. In late June 1944, he was serving as deputy commander of the 3rd Panzer Corps when Army Group Center collapsed. The corpses itself had disintegrated under Soviet attacks. 2 corps commanders had been killed in rapid succession. Von Ohlen was ordered to gather whatever forces remained and form Kampfgruppe of fans to defend Minsk. He was given command of the 5th Panzer Division, elements of the 170th Infantry Division and the 505 Heavy Tank Battalion. Additional forces would include rear area security units and stragglers from destroyed formations. The situation facing Army Group Center in late June 1944 was catastrophic. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive, had begun on June 23 with artillery bombardments along a 500 kilometers front. Within 72 hours, the German 9th Army had been encircled at Babarisk. The 3rd Panzer Army's 53rd Corps was destroyed at Vip. The 4th Army was being systematically crushed between converging Soviet forces. German commanders had underestimated Soviet strength, believing the main offensive would come further south. Hitler had refused permission for tactical withdrawals. Units ordered to hold fortified positions were bypassed and destroyed. By June 27, Army Group Center had lost 25 divisions. 300,000 men were dead, missing, or about to be trapped. The Soviet plan was elegant in its simplicity. Marshal Konstantin Rokossovsky's 1st Belarusian Front would drive northwest from the south. General Ivan Chernikovsky's 3rd Belarusian Front would attack from the northeast. The 2 pincers would meet west of Minsk, encircling everything to the east. Soviet mobile units were advancing 50 kilometers per day. German forces were retreating in disorder, abandoning equipment and wounded soldiers. The roads to Minsk were clogged with refugees and military vehicles. Soviet aircraft controlled the sky, attacking columns at will. The Luftwaffe had fewer than 100 operational aircraft in the entire sector. Von Ohlen deployed his forces on June 28 in positions designed to cover the main highways and rail lines into Minsk. The 5th Panzer Division's tank regiments took positions near Borisov on the main Moscow to Minsk road. The Panthers formed the forward line. The Panzer Mark versus established positions 2 kilometers back. The Tigers from the 505 Heavy Tank Battalion were positioned at the rail junction Otrupki to the east where they could cover the railway lines being used for evacuation. Infantry from the 170th Infantry Division held the road itself, creating a rear guard through which 4th Army units could retreat. The plan was to trade space for time, conducting a fighting withdrawal that would keep escape routes open while inflicting maximum casualties on pursuing Soviet forces. What Vonelin understood and what he could not say openly was that his Kampfgruppe was being sacrificed. The Soviet numerical advantage was overwhelming. Intelligence reports indicated at least 20 Soviet tank brigades converging on Minsk. The 5th Guards Tank Army alone had more armor than the entire German force in the sector. Even if every German tank destroyed 3 Soviet tanks before being knocked out, the mathematics favored the Soviets. The best Vonel could do was delay the inevitable, buying time measured in days, perhaps hours. On June 29, Soviet forces reached Boris. The 5th Guards Tank Army's reconnaissance elements probed German positions, testing defensive strength and identifying tank deployments. German artillery fired on advancing columns. Soviet aircraft bombed the bridges over the Berezina River. Vonelin's engineers demolished the bridges on June 30th, attempting to slow Soviet crossings. At about 12 hours, Soviet engineers constructed pontoon bridges during the night. By dawn on July 1st, Soviet armor was across the Berezina in strength. The major engagement began at 0800 hours on July 1, 1944. The Soviet 5th Guards Tank Army attacked with 3 tank brigades advancing on a 6 kilometers front. Over 150 tanks supported by infantry, artillery, and close air support. They came straight down the Minsk highway, hitting the Panthers in their forward positions. German gunners opened fire at maximum effective range, 1,400 meters for the Panthers' 75mm gun. The first wave of Soviet T-34 tanks advanced into concentrated fire. Panthers destroyed tanks methodically as they appeared. Burning T-34s littered the highway. Soviet crews abandoned damaged vehicles. German crews loaded and fired as quickly as possible, 6 rounds per minute with experienced loaders. But the Soviets kept coming. For every tank destroyed, 2 more appeared from the tree line. Soviet tactics relied on mass and momentum. Tank brigades attacked in waves, accepting casualties to overwhelm defensive positions. Individual Soviet tank crews had less training than German crews, but they were supported by overwhelming artillery and air power. Katyusha rocket launchers saturated German positions. Sturmovik ground attack aircraft made repeated low passes, firing rockets at identified tank positions. The Tigers at KRYKY destroyed Soviet tanks at ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. But Soviet forces simply bypassed the strong point, flowing around resistance like water around rocks. By mid-afternoon on July 1st, the Panthers had expended over 60% of their main gun ammunition. Several tanks had mechanical failures from continuous operation. 3 Panthers were destroyed by Soviet tank fire. 2 more were disabled by near misses from artillery. The CONF Gruppe had destroyed approximately 90 Soviet armored vehicles, but Soviet forces continued advancing. Vonelin ordered a phased withdrawal. The Panthers pulled back to secondary positions. The Panzer Marks moved forward to cover the withdrawal. German infantry conducted rear guard actions using Panzerfaust, anti-tank rockets at close range against pursuing Soviet armor. The fighting continued through July 2nd. Soviet forces attacked with fresh units, rotating exhausted brigades out of the line and bringing up reserves. The 5th Panzer Division fought a continuous series of engagements, withdrawing from one position to another, destroying Soviet tanks at every opportunity. German losses mounted steadily. 7 more Panthers destroyed. For Panzer Mark versus knocked out, 5 Tigers lost, 3 to enemy fire, and 2 to mechanical breakdown. The 505 Heavy Tank Battalion claimed 128 Soviet tanks destroyed, but all the Tigers were eventually lost. By the evening of July 2nd, the 5th Panzer Division had been reduced to approximately 80 operational tanks. The encirclement of Minsk closed on July 3rd. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps broke through defensive positions and entered the city in the early morning hours. Soviet forces liberated Minsk by July 4th. West of the city, the 65th Army and 5th Guards Tank Army completed the encirclement. The 4th Army and remnants of the 9th Army were trapped east of Minsk. Approximately 100,000 German soldiers were caught in the pocket. Over the following days, various units attempted breakouts. Most failed. Some small groups escaped through gaps in Soviet lines. The majority were killed or captured. Fonzin received authorization on July 2nd to withdraw toward Milodekno, 60 kilometers northwest of Minsk. The permission came too late for 4th Army, but saved Kung Group of Fonzin from complete destruction. The KG Gruppe conducted a fighting withdrawal through the first week of July, engaging Soviet pursuers in a series of delaying actions. They abandoned disabled vehicles, destroyed equipment that could not be moved, and fought rear guard battles to cover retreating infantry. By July 8th, the 5th Panzer Division reported only 18 operational tanks remaining. The division that had arrived with 125 tanks 11 days earlier had been effectively destroyed as a combat formation. The Soviet perspective on these engagements came from captured documents and post-war accounts. The 5th Guards Tank Army's war diary noted that German resistance northwest of Minsk was more determined than expected. Soviet commanders had anticipated breaking through in hours. Instead, the advance was delayed by nearly 3 days. Tank losses were higher than planned. One Soviet tank brigade commander reported that German tank crews were highly skilled, that their Panthers and Tigers were superior to Soviet tanks in direct combat, and that only numerical superiority allowed Soviet forces to advance. The delay, though measured in days rather than weeks, allowed several thousand German soldiers from other units to escape the Minsk encirclement before Soviet forces closed the pocket completely. Phonak Gruppe continued fighting through July, retreating steadily westward toward Lithuania. They participated in defensive battles at Molodino and Vilnius. By late July, what remained of the 5th Panzer Division was withdrawn from the front line for reconstitution. The division would be rebuilt with replacement personnel and equipment, but it would never regain the combat effectiveness it possessed in June 1944. Most of the experienced tank commanders were dead or wounded. The veteran crews who had fought at Kursk were gone. Unit cohesion developed through months of combat was destroyed. Von Alkelin continued commanding the 39th Panzer Corps through the fall of 1944. On August 1, 1944, he was promoted to General der Panzertruppe. He was mentioned in the Wehrmachtbar on July 5, 1944 for his actions during the Minsk defensive battles. The citation noted his Kampfgrupp's successful maintenance of escape routes for retreating German forces under overwhelming enemy pressure. Von Alkelin left the 39th Panzer Corps in late September 1944, when he was assigned to command the forming Panzer Grossdeutschland. In March 1945, von Alkelin was ordered to take command of the 2nd Army in East Prussia. He reported to Hitler's headquarters for the briefing, arriving with his cavalry saber on his belt and his Monel in place. According to witnesses, Vona gave a military salute rather than the Nazi salute required since July 20, 1944. He did not remove his Monel when saluting. He addressed Hitler as Herr Hitler rather than Mein Führer. When Hitler informed him that he would take orders from the local Nazi party Gauleiter in Danzig, Fonzin struck the map table with his hand and stated he had no intention of placing himself under the orders of a Gauleiter. Hitler surprisingly backed down, telling Fonzin to keep the command himself. The incident demonstrated von Alkelin's contempt for Nazi party interference in military operations. Von Alkelin commanded the 2nd Army during the defense of East Prussia in the final months of the war. He conducted a fighting withdrawal, repeatedly disobeying Hitler's orders to stand fast and die in place. Instead, he withdrew his forces when necessary to preserve them for continued resistance. In May 1945, with Germany's surrender imminent, von Alkelin rejected offers to escape by air. He surrendered to Soviet forces on the Hel Peninsula on May 9, 1945, one day after Germany's official surrender. He remained with his troops, going into Soviet captivity rather than abandoning them. Von Alkelin spent 10 years in Soviet prisons. He was held initially at Lubyanka prison in Moscow and transferred to Orel prison. During interrogation, he was beaten severely, suffering injuries that crippled him permanently. He was released in 1955 and returned to Germany. He died near Munich on September 27, 1980 at age 88. He was buried in a military cemetery. His grave marker lists his rank and decorations. Von San was the last German officer to receive the Knight's Cross with oak leaves, swords, and diamonds. Awarded on May 8, 1945, the final day of the war in Europe. General Adjutant Karl Decker, who commanded the 5th Panzer Division during the Minsk battles, continued leading the division through the summer of 1944. He was promoted to commanding general of the 39th Panzer Corps in late 1944. On January 1, 1945, he was promoted to General der Tropa. In April 1945, his corps was trapped in the Ruhr Pocket during the American encirclement of German forces in western Germany. On April 21, 1945, with his forces surrounded and out of supplies, Decker committed suicide. He was 47 years old. He received the oak leaves to his Knight's Cross on May 4, 1944 for his leadership of the 5th Panzer Division during defensive operations earlier that year. The 5th Panzer Division was officially disbanded in April 1945. Unit records indicate that approximately 15,000 men served with the division during 1944. Fewer than 2,000 survived the war. The division's casualty rate exceeded 85%. Most casualties occurred during Operation Bagration and subsequent defensive battles in Poland and East Prussia. The division's final commander was Oberhans Georg Herzog, who surrendered remaining elements to Soviet forces in Danzig in May 1945. Soviet forces achieved complete victory in Operation Bagration. Between June 23 and August 19, 1944, they advanced 600 kilometers, liberated Belarusia, and destroyed 28 of the 34 divisions in Army Group Center. German casualties totaled approximately 400,000 killed, wounded, and captured. It was Germany's worst defeat on the Eastern Front. The offensive occurred simultaneously with the Allied breakout from Normandy and France, stretching German military resources beyond sustainability. Hitler had committed substantial forces to defend against the invasion in the West, leaving Army Group Center dangerously weak. Operation Bagration demonstrated that Germany no longer possessed the military capacity to defend on multiple fronts. The tank battle northwest of Minsk on July 1 and 2, 1944 represented a microcosm of Germany's strategic situation. German forces possessed superior equipment and better trained crews. A Panther tank was more effective than a T-34 in direct combat. German tank commanders had more experience. German doctrine emphasized quality over quantity, technical superiority over mass production. But these advantages no longer mattered. Soviet industrial production overwhelmed German technical superiority. The Soviet Union produced more tanks in 1 month than Germany produced in 60 months. Soviet training programs graduated sufficient crews to operate these tanks. Soviet tactical doctrine accepted casualties that would devastate German formations. The mathematics were inexorable. Germany could win individual battles but was losing the war of attrition. Vona's defense of the Minsk approaches demonstrated professional military competence under impossible conditions. He deployed his forces effectively, conducted an orderly fighting withdrawal, and inflicted significant casualties on pursuing Soviet forces. His confra destroyed approximately 295 Soviet armored vehicles over 11 days of fighting. The delay allowed several thousand German soldiers from other units to escape the Minsk encirclement. But tactical success could not alter strategic reality. Army Group Center was destroyed. The Fourth Army ceased to exist. The road to Poland and East Prussia lay open to Soviet forces. Military historians debate whether different decisions could have altered outcomes during Operation Bagration. Some argue that earlier permission for tactical withdrawals would have saved German forces from encirclement. Others contend that Army Group Center was doomed regardless of tactical choices, that Soviet numerical superiority and operational skill made defeat inevitable. The reality was that Hitler's refusal to authorize retreats until situations became desperate guaranteed that withdrawals occurred under the worst possible conditions. Units ordered to hold fortified positions were bypassed and destroyed. Mobile reserves were committed piecemeal to plug gaps rather than concentrated for counterattacks. Command relationships were unclear, with multiple authorities issuing contradictory orders. Fonolin's effectiveness at Minsk derived partly from operating with limited supervision. Army Group Cent's command structure had collapsed. Communications were disrupted. Higher headquarters could not effectively control tactical operations. Von Alkelin possessed the authority to make decisions based on battlefield conditions rather than directives from distant commanders ignorant of local situations. He withdrew when withdrawal was necessary. He committed forces when commitment made tactical sense. He preserved his CONF group's combat capability by refusing to sacrifice it pointlessly. These were fundamental principles of mobile warfare. But in Hitler's Germany, such common-sense military decisions often constituted insubordination. The broader strategic implications of Operation Bagration extended beyond territorial losses. Germany's military reserves were exhausted. New divisions existed primarily on paper, equipped with obsolete weapons and manned by inadequately trained personnel. The Luftwaffe could no longer contest air superiority, fuel shortages, restricted training and operations. German industry subjected to sustained Allied bombing could not replace losses. The army that invaded the Soviet Union in June 1941, with over 3 million men and thousands of tanks and aircraft, no longer existed. What remained were fragments, veteran units like the Fifth Panzer Division, ground down to ineffectiveness and replacement formations, lacking the training, equipment, and leadership necessary for modern combat. For the men who fought at Minsk in July 1944, these strategic considerations meant little. They fought because they were soldiers, because their orders required it, because their comrades depended on them. German tank crews climbed into Panthers knowing they faced overwhelming odds. They loaded ammunition, identified targets, fired, reloaded, and fired again until their tanks were destroyed or their ammunition exhausted. Infantry held defensive positions against Soviet assaults. Engineers demolished bridges. Artillery crews fired until overrun. They did not fight for Hitler or National Socialism. They fought because military discipline and unit cohesion compelled continued resistance even when hope was gone. Soviet soldiers attacking German positions at Minsk faced their own brutal realities. Tank crews climbed into T-34s, understanding that German guns could penetrate their armor at ranges where they could not effectively return fire. They advanced knowing many would die, that Soviet tactics relied on overwhelming German positions through numerical superiority even at heavy cost. But Soviet crews also understood they were winning. The Red Army was advancing, liberating Soviet territory, driving toward Germany itself. Each kilometer gained brought them closer to ending the war. Soviet casualties, though substantial, were sustainable. Soviet production replaced losses. The trajectory of the war favored the Soviet Union. The destruction of the 5th Panzer Division at Minsk represented the end of an era in German armored warfare. The division had fought in Poland, France, Yugoslavia, Greece, and Russia. It had participated in Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union in June 1941. It fought at Vyazma, Bryansk, and Moscow. It survived the Soviet winter counteroffensive of 1941 to 1942. It participated in defensive battles around Rusev and Orel. It fought at Kursk in July 1943, the last major German offensive on the Eastern Front. Throughout these campaigns, the 5th Panzer maintained its reputation as one of the most effective armored divisions in the Wehrmacht. Soviet intelligence reports advised avoiding direct engagement with the division when possible. That reputation died at Minsk in July 1944. The battlefield northwest of Minsk is farmland today. Local farmers occasionally discover tank wrecks buried in their fields, rusted hulks of Panthers and T-34s that fought there 80 years ago. No monuments mark where Fonolin's K-Gruppe made its stand. The villages through which they fought were rebuilt. The forests where tanks dulled grew back. Life continued. The men who fought there are mostly dead now. German and Soviet soldiers, tank crews, and infantry all gone. Their battles survive only in official records and fading memories. Von Sulkin never discussed the Minsk battles in detail after the war. Soviet authorities questioned him repeatedly during imprisonment about his role in Operation Bagration, seeking information about German defensive tactics and command structures. Fanakin provided factual answers to military questions while refusing to provide information that might compromise other German officers still in Soviet custody. After his release, he avoided public attention, declining interviews and refusing to participate in veteran organizations. Friends described him as a man who had done his duty as he understood it, who made the best decisions possible under terrible circumstances, and who carried the weight of those decisions quietly for the rest of his life. The lesson of Minsk, if lessons can be drawn from such events, concerns the limits of tactical competence in the face of strategic impossibility. Fanakin was an excellent commander. The 5th Panzer Division was well-trained and equipped. They fought effectively against superior numbers. But effectiveness could not overcome the fundamental strategic reality that Germany was losing the war. No amount of tactical skill could compensate for the crushing numerical and industrial advantages the Soviet Union possessed by mid-1944. Individual battles might be won. Delaying actions might succeed temporarily, but the outcome was determined by factors beyond any single commander's control. Wars are decided by arithmetic, production capacity, population, resources, logistics, all reduced to numbers. Germany entered the war with smaller numbers than its enemies. German strategy depended on winning quickly before superior enemy resources could be mobilized. When that strategy failed and when the war became one of attrition, Germany's defeat became inevitable. The tank battle at Minsk demonstrated this arithmetic. Fanakin Campa destroyed. 3 Soviet tanks for every German tank lost. By traditional measures, they won the tactical engagement. But the Soviets had more tanks. They could absorb losses and continue attacking. Germany could not. That simple fact determined the war's outcome more certainly than any number of tactical victories. If you found this story compelling, please like this video, subscribe to stay connected with more stories from the Second World War. Each one reveals how individuals confronted impossible situations, made difficult decisions, and lived with the consequences. Leave a comment telling us where you are watching from. Thank you for watching, and thank you for remembering these events.